Hello and welcome to the digital platform of Shadhan Chandra Mahavidyalaya. I, Gautam Maji, Assistant Professor as well as at the Department of English, have the privilege to conduct as well as host this session. As you know that we have been organizing this lecture series for a long time and we have already successfully conducted 27 session. This is our 28th session and we are very happy that we are here with another great and world famous academician amongst us. And as you know that this lecture series is helping the student community, that the feedback we are receiving from the students. So thank you for joining us. And as you know that our today's guest is a very special guest. So who is he? That is also going in the scroll bar of this screen. But before I welcome this great academician on our digital platform, I would like to play a short video about this man, and then I will welcome our honorable guest on our digital platform. So before welcoming him, I'd like to play the short video. So let's watch it. So the short video is over. So now I'd like to welcome our uh, uh, very own and great academician on our digital platform. So I'd like to welcome our very own Jan Almond. So welcome on our digital platform.
Thank you. I didn't expect that. That's well, thank
Okay.
you. Right.
Okay.
That's my wedding suit. I have a picture of me in my wedding suit. So
Okay. কেমন আছেন আপনি?
ভালো খুব ভালো খুব সবকিছু ভালো আমি খুব কৃতজ্ঞ আপনি কেমন
আমরা
আছেন
আমি খুব ভালো আছি এবং আপনাকে আমাদের মধ্যে পেয়ে আমরা খুবই খুশি এবং আনন্দিত এবং তার সঙ্গে ভীষণভাবে আমরা সম্মানিত বোধ করছি। So, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. As you know that already you have been conducting this session, and 27th session you have successfully conducted, and you have watched some of the videos that I sent you. So, if you say about our venture, that we're very happy to get this words from you.
No, thank you very much to Sharan Chandra and Mahavidyalaya and to the students who are watching this. Thanks very much for inviting me to talk today about my research. I hope it will be of some use to the institution today. So, thank you very much. Onik Donaba.
Thank you, sir. And today, Sai is going to deliver a lecture on a very special genre of writing, that is ghost story. And this ghost story, we get very much attracted to ghost story in our childhood. Even today, also, whenever we listen to any ghost story on different radio channels, and even we go through any book, then we really feel very thrilled. We get thrilled and enthralled. So today, we'd like to listen several things about in three languages, particularly Turkish, Mexican, and Bengali languages. And the ways I'm talking about in fiction of ghost story. So, the session is yours. And if you have all the participants who are watching right now, so if you have any question, you can drop your question in the comment box. And after his lecture, then I will take all the questions and I'll get back to him for the answers.
Okay.
So, sir, the session is yours.
Thank you very much. So yeah, I'm just going to talk today about the ghost story. Gautam said it's for lovers of ghost stories. I'm sorry to say that I will probably kill the love of the ghost story because it's an analysis of what the ghost story means, which is kind of the opposite of the adrenaline rush, the thrill that you get when you listen to or you hear a ghost story. But I'm going to try and speak about, I don't want to speak too long about it. So I'll try and go through the main points. First out, I want to say that what I'm talking about is the chapter of a book that is coming out next year on world literature. And one of the reasons why I'm drawing on Turkish Bengali and Mexican literature, it's a book on world literature, which is frustrated with what many people perceive to be the largely Western Euro-American primacy and influence in concepts of world literature. So it's an attempt to sort of decenter this Western hold on concepts of world literature by looking at three non-Western countries, because the non-West is the majority of the planet, right? What we think of the West, Europe and America, don't even make up 10% of the planet. So there's a kind of strategic element to me looking at three countries, three literary traditions like this. I should be careful, obviously, saying country, because although it's Bengali literature, obviously, sadly or not, I don't want to get political, but obviously it's two countries now, not one. But certainly we're looking today at probably sort of like Hindu Western Bengali writers as such. And also it's against a background, it's not just a frustration along spatial terms, i.e. along the overwhelmingly Western dominance of these concepts, but it's also taken as its background a lot of the work by theorists on world literature, by people like Franco Moretti and the Warwick Research Group, which have been trying to look at the background of capitalism in the construction and distribution of literary texts. So looking at how capital and structures of capital and the kind of modernity that comes with capitalism goes hand in hand, if you like, with the evolution and the construction and the development of literary systems. And it's looking at the ghost story in that regard as well. And I'm saying that because what I'm really going to be looking at today are patterns across these three cultures, okay? So I'm looking at, and when I say patterns, we're not really talking about, the universal spirit of man and how there are common things that we all share, but rather phenomena, developments in the evolution of the ghost story, which suggest analogous structures of modernity or analogous trajectories of modernity, even in three contexts as different as Turkey, Bengal, and Mexico, which I've deliberately and provocatively chosen to make the point. Obviously, it was one of the big differences. The ghost story I'm gravitating towards because the ghost story is interesting because it says a lot about the anxieties of a society. Ghost stories say a great deal about the unspeakabilities, the taboo notions, the subjects which are somehow unpalatable or deemed excluded from the mainstream discourse. It could be the memory of a genocide, it could be a new emerging moneyed class, it could be a fresh new religion, but they are things which are somehow sort of occluded or excluded from the mainstream culture. And so it's in this sense that the ghost story almost as a kind of leak, a discharge which takes place. As a symbolic order groans and creaks under the weight of a new element that's introduced. So it really is in this sense of the ghost story, even if you like, as a kind of litmus paper, trying to understand exactly what kind of transitions are taking place between one discourse and another. I said differences. I mean, there are certainly the three regions we're talking about are very, very different. And we could even start with the words, right? So for the words for ghost do have these different connotations. And certainly, to lump them crudely together, the Spanish and the Turkish word for ghost, which is fantasma and hayalet, both are words which stem from the word for imagination, hayal in Arabic and fantasia in Spanish. And so it suggests that these words already have there's already a kind of cynical secularism built into the etymology of the word for ghosts. Whereas the word in Bengali and obviously in many northern Indo-Iranian languages, Hindi included, bhut, doesn't have that connotation of imagination. It's actually the old participle of a word, Sanskritic word, to be. It actually is related to the verb to be, which suggests already a different etymology and genealogy of the word there. And of course, there are others as well. There are other quite powerful differential factors in between these three. The Quranic notion of jinn, for example, these forces which can either be good or evil, doesn't really have an exact equivalent in Bengali and Mexican literature. The idea of the tribal, of the Adivasi, whilst obviously having a parallel in Mexican literature with the indigenous, you can't really think of anything like that for historical reasons within Turkish literature. There's no real notion of the tribal. It would be a bit ludicrous to call Armenians or Kurds, tribals or indigenous people. There's no concept as such as of indigeneity in that sense. But nevertheless, I really sort of want to look today at a certain common structure that recurs through all of these texts. And basically, it's in all of these ghost stories that I'm going to be looking at. I'm looking at 6 of them. We're looking at, it's the same idea again and again of someone, a protagonist, almost always male, who comes into a haunted place or house. And it's a structure which is invariably haunted by a female ghost, by a female spirit, and then invariably ends up losing themselves to that spirit and becoming the ghost themselves. So in a variety of different authors, we're going to be looking at this same trope again, again, and again. And these authors range from these texts we're looking at do have a sort of very wide, the earliest is 1888 and the latest is 1965. So there's a time range that's quite wide, and obviously they're written in Calcutta, in Mexico City, in Istanbul. So again, I'm stressing the differences here, but we're looking at the commonalities. And I think perhaps the first thing that we're going to see in all of these stories is the idea of empire. The idea of empire in all of these stories that I'm going to be talking about plays in a kind of background way. So the first story we'll look at is Rabindranath Tagore's The Hungry Stones, Kushudita Pasha, which, let me just get I'm just going to bring up just for a second, make sure I have it. It's a story about, as I'm sure some of our students will know, it's a story about a tax collector who visits a ruin, which is an old palace, an old Mughal palace, and in the daytime it's a ruin, but at night it takes on this magical sort of appearance of an Oriental pleasure palace. And there's sort of nymphs and houris and all kinds of magical creatures, and the tax collector, who's a kind of he's a local clerk, a Bengali clerk, begins to have hallucinations about this place, and he's drawn back to it magnetically every night, again and again. And eventually, he almost ends up becoming one of these creatures himself. And it's a very famous story. And I think what is interesting about it is the centrality to which empire plays in this story in so many ways. I'll read a passage from it because I'd like to show this. And I'm hoping people can see this. About 250 years ago, Shah Muhammad II built the palace as a private pleasure dome. In those days, there were rose-scented fountains in the bathrooms. Young Persian concubines sat in seclusion on cool marble. Those fountains play no longer. There is no one to inhabit the palatial emptiness of the place, but a single lonely tax collector. At first, the desolation of the palace oppressed me like a weight on my chest. The whole building seemed alive. It was sucking me in, and its powerful stomach juices were digesting me slowly. I think that this is interesting, in part because what we have is, when we were talking about empire, the Mughal Empire erupts into this story. This is a story written in Tagore's very Sanskritized Shadubhasha, his very Sanskritized Bengali, even though, ironically, the actual identity of the Bengali Hindu is effaced. And it's a story within a story. So the frame is that the narrator is sitting on a train going to visit a relative and starts hearing this story, Arabian Nights style, and then the story of the pleasure palace begins. But the way the Mughal appears, this memory, if you like, of a Persian past with all of the Persian language and all of the Oriental motifs that you get with it, all of these Arabian Nights motifs, really sort of like shows a kind of bubble of Mughal time persisting within this story, which is really set in the time of the British Raj. And in many ways, it exemplifies what is so interesting about the ghost story, that a ghost story, in many ways, is a conflict between two times. A ghost story is a moment where one time interrupts another, clashes with another. And the ghost, if you like, the spectral, emerges out of this conflict, out of this jarring moment between the two times. And the protagonist of the story begins to sort of keep going every night to this ruin. So in the daytime, we have the idea of the ruin as between day and night, as just a sort of like a dilapidated Mughal palace. But at night, it takes on this magical illusion. If you like, almost in Weber's sense, it re-enchants itself. And I guess here, there's obviously an influence here on Tagore from sort of British romantics, particularly Coleridge and Kubla Khan. Like there's an invocation here, certainly, of the kind of pleasure palace of Kubla Khan from Coleridge that Tagore has felt himself influenced by in the reproduction of this basically Bengali Orientalist version of a kind of Islam, of a kind of Islamic Orient. And within it, you could really say almost that there's a memory here of pleasure. You know, when we look at the nymphs, when we look at the opium, when we look at the water pipe and the dancing, it's almost as if Tagore is not just fantasizing or romanticizing, but even sexualizing a memory of Mughal empire here. And it is one which is, because he himself is a tax collector, it's one which is posited against the very British sterile modernity in which the story is set. And this idea of sexuality being involved in the ghost story we'll get back to in a moment. But in the end, of course, the protagonist is caught between two empires. Tagore's protagonist, in the end, feels abandoned by both. Like he has to withdraw from these nightly hallucinations where he almost becomes a Mughal clerk himself again. His tight-fitting English jacket becomes a kind of loose, baggy pajamas, a coat, and he starts to sort of feel he becomes indolent. He loses concentration. You can see already there's a clash of empires going on here in this story. But you could also see here, I think, almost see here a kind of nihilism, perhaps, in this use of the ghost story here, where the possibility that we discover that when we finally free ourselves of the trappings of these power structures, be it Mughal, be it British, there's a very post-colonial moment where the post-colonial subject doesn't really know what self is left over for them. And certainly in Tagore's story, you could feel this sort of like melancholy moment of emptiness almost as the narrator finally returns to the British modern present. And in many ways, that sort of idea of there being some kind of link between the ghost story and empire here understood as a kind of memory of power, leads us to another ghost story, this time by Bibhutibhushan Banerjee or Bandyopadhyay. It's a story called Maya. And in many ways, it follows a lot of the same lines as Tagore's. So it's about a vagrant, a poor young Brahmin who's homeless, who's wandering through a jungle and comes upon a house with an older landlord who says, if you cook for me, I'll let you live in the house. And of course, he goes to live in this house and work for the landlord. And the landlord leaves for Calcutta and leaves the young protagonist, who is the narrator of the story, in charge of the house. And of course, you guessed it again, the house is haunted. He starts to see these strange dancing, just like Tagore's palace. Every night, during the day, there's nothing, but at night, he starts to see dancing. He starts to see strange women, starts to smell fragrances of jasmine, starts to hear noises of laughter in the house. And just like Tagore's protagonist, he becomes magnetically drawn to the house to the extent that he can't leave the house anymore. And there is if we can again look at the story here, all the people who've stayed in that house before kept seeing some strange woman there. In the end, things reached the point where they simply refused to budge from the house. They just got thinner and thinner and wasted away until they finally died. It goes like this. First, the person becomes strangely attached to the house, apurbanesha, so he won't move from it. Then he loses interest in eating and he refuses to go anywhere else. And this story, on a number of levels, and it's called Maya. In English, it's called strange attachment, but in Bengali, it's called Maya, obviously referring to the Hindu term for the world as a veil of illusion. In many ways, this story, first of all, you can understand it as a kind of spiritual story. So, the idea that the thing you possess ends up possessing you. He's very happy to come into the ownership of this empty house. And at the beginning, it feels like a boon. But we quickly learn that boon, that reward, that lucky gift is actually cursed. As he loses less and less interest in stepping outside the house. It's almost like the house is absorbing him, just like Tagore's magical palace. So there is a spiritual metaphor going on here, perhaps, that to own something ultimately means that it ends up owning you. There is also a kind of comment here on some version of the messianic. So the landlord promises he will come back from Calcutta, and the protagonist is left in the house waiting for the landlord to come back. And, you've guessed it already, the landlord never reappears. So the protagonist's life is almost permanently put on hold as he perennially keeps this house, waiting for the return of, and also the landlord's name, the only name we get in the text is Chakrabarti. And anyone who knows their Hindu philosophy will know Chakravartin is one of probably the closest thing in Hinduism, I would say, to that figure of the Messiah. Yeah, along with the Maitreya Buddha, the Chakravartin, literally from the Sanskrit Chakravartatya, someone who turns the wheel of the age. There's a certain. You could almost say that there may be a mockery of the messianic in Bibhutibhushan's story. What it means to be frozen in time, waiting for something to happen, and the fact that real time outside goes on. There's a number of Bibhutibhushan's stories of his Chotogolpe that deal brilliantly, I think, with the way time passes. And the fact that time passes for different people at different speeds and in different ways. And certainly in this story, the ghost story, that seems to be the case, that by stepping into this haunted house, he's stepped into a separate pocket of time. And finally, because we're talking about empire, there may be a colonial allegory here. And I'll say my words very carefully. And obviously, Bengali students, you know, this is your culture. I'd be happy to hear what you think about it. But there's no reference whatsoever, even though the story is written in the 30s, in the middle of the Quit India movement, there's no reference whatsoever in Maya to the British or to any kind of sort of independence movement. However, Maya has an almost non-supernatural sister story called Uncle Bandul's House, Mama Bandul Bari, Bandul Mama Bari, which is about an uncle. It's told from a child's point of view about an uncle who is trying to finish a house in the middle of the jungle and never finishes it. It never gets completed. And it's very haunting, but not a ghost story. It's a very haunting story because the child, at various points in the protagonist's life, the narrator comes back to this house and constantly sees it. This house that he thought was going to be a wonderful house, sees it basically go to rack and ruin because it gets stopped halfway, and then the Uncle Bandul dies. And there's a political comment explicitly in that story because the protagonist is involved in the anti-colonial movement and involved actively in the anti-colonial activism. And it's difficult not to see something like that in Maya, even though I stress there's no explicit reference to the political. There may be some kind of comment on the futility of all political projects. In this idea of a ghost story, of a haunted house, which absorbs its owner and never really frees them from their sort of perennial stewardship. That's the most I'll say about that. But again, you know, we see this kind of colonial allegory here, and it does suggest, I think, that there may be something phantasmatic about empire in all of these stories. All of these stories I'm looking at, empire is always going to be kind of morbidly undead. It's going to be sort of lurking, you know, it's in all of these stories, these ghost stories take place in the aftermath of empire and in the aftermath of be it Ottoman, be it Mughal, be it British, be it Mexican Second Empire, be it Aztec. In all of these stories, there's some kind of relationship here between the persistence of the spectral and the kind of like the undead persistence or obstinacy of the memory of empire, which kind of lives on. And it does take us really. I mentioned Mexican Second Empire. It takes us to the Mexican stories. Because another of the things that going through all of these stories, all of these ghost stories, is that they're all involved in some way or another with history. And when I say history, some of them are explicitly involved with the discipline of history and the idea or vocation of the historian. So Tampanar has a fictitious historian in his novel, as we'll see. Tagore's protagonist is reading histories and referencing histories. And certainly here, the idea of history insofar as a memory of violence now, not simply a memory of empire, but the memory of violence seems to sort of occupy some kind of proximity with the ghost story. So if we look at Carlos Fuentes' 1965 novella, really, it is a rewriting, I would say, it is a rewriting of a short story by an earlier, it's called La Cena, by Alberto Reyes. But it is a story of a young historian who is invited by an aunt and her niece into the house of an old colonial house to write up the memoirs of the aunt's deceased husband, a general during the Mexican Second Empire. And I'll just read out a bit of it from it now. So, and I should say that the story is written in the second person singular. The same evening, you read those yellow papers written in mustard-colored ink, some of them with holes where a careless ash had fallen, others heavily fly-specked. General Llorente's French doesn't have the merits his wife attributed to it. You tell yourself you can make considerable improvements in the style, can tighten up his rambling account of past events, his childhood on a hacienda in Oaxaca, his military studies in France, his friendship with the intimates of Napoleon III, his return to Mexico on the staff of Maximilian, the imperial ceremonies and gatherings, the battles, the defeat in 1867, his exile in France. As you undress, you think of the old lady's distorted notions, El capricho deformado de la anciana, the value she attributes to these memoirs. You smile as you get into bed, thinking of the 4,000 pesos. So in this story, we have, again, the same pattern, okay? It's the young protagonist here, his name is Felipe, agrees to enter this house, which it increasingly seems to be haunted by the aunt and the niece, who acquire an increasingly spectral, almost phantasmagorical hue as the story progresses. And eventually, the historian becomes the general. He becomes almost the reincarnation of the deceased husband. So it's a very sort of eerie and uncanny story. And again, like we're seeing here, first of all, the irony of the historian becoming history. I mean, that's the most obvious thing to say here. There's a kind of irony on the hubris of the historian, the idea that you could sort of like make an object of something. You attempt to study an archive, but you end up becoming a part of the archive you thought you were going to sort of categorize and analyze. And certainly also, I think there's something about the second person style of the text, which introduces a strange kind of dialectic with the reader. And just as the historian is incorporated into the history, it is almost like in a ghostly way, the reader themselves, you, are incorporated into the story as you read it. But I guess that we should also notice how, as in the other two stories, again, the house changes from night to day. We see the house shifting in shape. So at the daytime, it looks like a modern apartment block. But then at various points, it starts to shift and change. And in certain moments, it even takes on a kind of colonial era feel of an old mansion. So we're seeing exactly the same mechanism again. And the idea that this happens at night, you know, when all things are allowed, as opposed to the prohibitive glare of daytime, suggests a kind of vein of sexuality in the novel. And the novel is explicitly sexual. Like the young niece is sexually attractive and is certainly sexually attractive to the historian. And there's definitely a feel of the femme fatale here as well. The femininity, if you like, of the female character is not only powerful, but it's also threatening. And it does also. I'm coming back to this idea of the way the house changes from time to time. Because it does suggest, I'm thinking here of Bakhtin's chronotope, the fusion of time and place of Chronos and Topos, because it does suggest that the ghost story is a kind of stubborn chronotope which refuses to be dissolved by the dissolving forces of modernity. It's almost like a little nugget which refuses to be incorporated into the zeitgeist of the present. And certainly in this bifurcation of the locale from day to night, you see this kind of schizophrenic status of the haunted house, or the haunted structure here. But I think the most important thing to say here in this story, in Aura, in this novella by Carlos Fuentes, is that we see this sort of explicit idea of the ghost story as a returning of the past upon the present, and almost a revenge, a reoccupation of the past upon the present, as this historian, who thinks he's in control, thinks he's going to earn a quick 4,000 pesos by this job, actually ends up being absorbed and subsumed by the structure he thought he was going to be visiting. And here there are, I should say, looking at the various critical readings of Aura by various literary critics, there are definitely critics who have this approach to it. There are critics who suggest that there is something Aztec about a number of the figures in the story. Not just the old aunt, whom some people see as Tezcatlipoca, or the castrating witch, in if you like, in certainly within Mayan mythology, but also the nieces Coatlicue, the fertility goddess. There's all kinds of ways in which you get the sense that the historian, as he keeps going back to this house, and as he gets drawn into this ghostly house, it's almost like he's a sacrifice being gradually led up the steps of a pyramid, almost at the end, to be presented as a young, clean body for the new reincarnation of the spirit of this old general. And you literally have here this idea of history taking over the body of the present and returning to it in a very dark way. So even though I think there's a commentary here on the hubris of the academic, a disturbing commentary if you happen to be an academic, I think there's also kind of a commentary on the futility of history itself, the idea, the delusion that history can never really get outside of itself, that the past in a kind of dark way continually comes to re-emerge. And certainly you can understand, if you think of a ghost story as anything, you see it as a ghost story as a refusal of history to remain history. Right? A ghost story is a refusal of history to simply stay put. And in this sense, ghost stories have this sort of slightly undead feel about them. And that idea of really sort of brings up to the question of, are ghost stories conservative or are they disruptive? Because in one sense, when you consider what I've said, you could really see how the ghost story may well indeed be subversive, but because it takes the repressed past that we want to move beyond, that officially state histories want to leave behind, whether it's murdered indigenous people, whether it's genocide, whether it's sexual incest, all kinds of the unpalatable past we don't want to think about. And it reemerges and disrupts and subverts the present. So you could see something even politically progressive in the idea of the ghost story in that sense. But at the same time, you could argue that the ghost story also has a deeply conservative aspect to it, insofar as the intangibility of the ghost is never really allowed to affect the material present. So the ghost is there, but there's a kind of semantic recognition of the ghost without anything ever materially, concretely, politically going further. It's simply it's almost incorporated back into the fabric of the mainstream. And certainly, I think in Fuentes' case, you could argue that. And also, looking ahead to Bea Misafa, the other texts I'm going to talk about, you could argue that it is a way of incorporating the incongruous into mainstream discourse. I'm going to try and move quickly on here because we're already at 30. Well, I've already been speaking for over half an hour. I didn't want to spend so much time. But it does bring us to the other Mexican text, which is, for Mexican readers, easily the most famous and influential, domestically influential novel in Mexican literature, which is Juan Rulfo's Pedro Páramo. And this is a text written in the 1940s. And again, like all the other previous texts I've talked about, this pattern occurs in it. So, the protagonist, Juan Preciado, ventures to a haunted place, which by daytime looks like an abandoned town, but at night literally becomes a ghost town, right? At night it becomes populated by all kinds of spirits. And he ends up dying and becoming a ghost himself. So again, you get this sort of like this recurring mechanism. And I would say tentatively that there is just as with Fuentes, there is a kind of aspect of the pre-Columbian here, of the pre-contact cultures here. In this town, which is, although there are many interpretations of the text because it is a canonical novel, and certainly one of the interpretations of this novel, which is set in this, like I say, in this abandoned, very sort of lonely, desolate town, is that it's a comment on the failure of the Mexican Revolution. But there are sort of like a number of reasons for thinking that there is something about a memory of race and racial violence in the text. Race comes up. I mean, we say this because Juan Rulfo himself was what they call an indigenous expert, an indigenista. He wasn't indigenous. He didn't belong to any kind of indigenous group, but he was a director for almost 20 years of an indigenous research institute. And the short story, which is the model for the novel I'm talking about, it's called Luvina, was based on a visit that he did to an indigenous town. I think it's Ixtlan de Juarez. And then finally, I think one of the reasons why perhaps there is more of an indigenous aspect to this story than is acknowledged is that in this text as well, you do have, there's a couple of mentions of race, but more importantly in Pedro Páramo, there's a lot of indigenous words. There's a lot of words from Nahuatl which appear in the text. If you like, lying beneath the linguistic topsoil of the Spanish prose of the text, there is a number of words. And when we look, interestingly, at the original draft of Páramo's text, of Juan Rulfo's novel, the famous line, which in Spanish is Vine a Comala, I came to Comala. The original line didn't have Comala, it had the pre-Hispanic name of the town, Tuscahuesco, which was removed and replaced by Comala by the author. And it does suggest that there's, even in the novel itself, there is some kind of deletion of history going on here. But I guess what we're gravitating towards here is idea of ghost stories as reenacting some kind of memory, not just of violence, but even of genocidal violence, even of tremendous violence that takes place. There's something about the spectral which is linked to this inability of mainstream historiography to digest these utterly unpalatable, unacceptable, unthinkable moments of violence in the past. We're getting on the final bit of the talk, and from there I'm moving to Turkish texts because, and that's all of the things I've said for the Mexican and Bengali texts are going to be re-emerge again when we talk about Turkey, because the Ottoman Empire obviously has its own histories of violence. But one of the things I'd like to concentrate in these final two Turkish texts here is the loss of self, the fact that in all of these ghost stories, the self, and it's usually a male self, is lost and usurped by the spiritual entity, which is usually a female entity. The first text I'd look at would be Peyami Safa's Mademoiselle Noralia's Armchair. So this is a text which hasn't been translated into English. It's a Turkish novel. I think it's written in 1951. In Turkish, it's Mademoiselle Noralia'nın Koltuğu. And it's the story of a young man, Ferit, who acquires a house, and in the attic of that house there's an armchair, which is possessed by the spirit of the former owner of the house, who is an old Italian-Turkish woman. And when Ferit sits in the chair, the old Ottoman Christian woman, Mademoiselle Noralia, possesses Ferit. And it's not a malevolent possession story by any means. In fact, in many words, it's a kind of moment of transcendence. But it follows the pattern we've been looking at in all of these stories. I'll actually, we'll have a look at the passage here from it. This is Ferit. He sat in the chair. The palm of his hand felt hot. He sensed something and closed his eyes. He sensed something and looked for himself. He sensed something and tried to break away from it. His memory blocked. Now in his consciousness there was no self. There was an other, larger, infinite self, united with everything else. There was a self which came out of him and hung on him. Everything. It was one with an absolute. And this moment in the story is quite interesting. I think more than anything, it says a great deal about male anxieties. Not just this moment of possession, but in all of the stories we've been looking at. How there's a very male anxiety about losing yourself to some kind of female ghost or female spirit. And it does suggest that sexuality plays a central role in the idea of the ghost story. And certainly an almost phallic fear of losing one's, being emasculated by being absorbed into a larger female structure. So there's an element of sort of, you might almost say sort of misogynistic anxiety here, going through these fears that we see recurring in these various ghost stories. And you know, it really suggests that the ghost story works hand in hand with patriarchy, insofar as it sort of patrols and supervises these moments where a fear is sort of elicited and rendered spectral, almost as a kind of defense mechanism, you might say. I think it becomes as well interesting that when we think of the author, so Peyami Safa, for people who don't know him, and I think most people won't know him, he's not an internationally famous Turkish author. He's not like Orhan Pamuk or anyone. But Peyami Safa was quite a nationalist writer, and certainly had very strong feelings about Turkish national identity and their resistance towards foreign invasion, foreign influence. So again, we may feel that there's something that harmonizes there with this kind of anxiety. But at the same time, I think it's very interesting when we consider the violence on minorities within the Ottoman Empire. And obviously, I'm thinking primarily of Armenians, the large number of Armenians who were killed in the events of 1893 to 94, and then also of 1915. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of Armenians that were murdered, all as part of a kind of nation-state project to produce a Sunni Turkish ethnic state, which would have a monocultural identity. And so here you can see how multiculturalism, or a memory of the multicultural, becomes spectral. Yeah, in a moment where those kinds of memories are prohibited, they find their release, as I said, they leak, if you like, through the symbolic structure of the nation state in the form of these little ghost stories. I think an equivalent would be, if you look at the way indigenous groups that have had history and violences on them in American popular culture find their reemergence in sort of like supernatural and horror stories, whether it's Pet Sematary, which is a Native American sacred ground, whether it's the magical cigar box Indian in another of Stephen King's stories, whether it's the indigenous people and werewolves and the Twilight scene. There's all kinds of references in popular culture to the way Native Americans sort of persist in the collective memory, the acceptable collective memory of North American popular culture. And certainly here, I think what's most interesting here in this case is this is a conservative writer who's doing this, okay? So Peyami Safar was no sort of liberal, he was no sort of friend of necessarily of Armenians. But the fact that the ghost here is incorporated is a Christian ghost, an Italian Turkish woman, is interesting. Suggests not just a male sexual anxiety, but also a sort of a religious anxiety as well, about the purity of one's own culture, the agency of one's own culture. I also want to sort of mention that there's property involved in all of these stories. So all of these stories have some kind of property. And we're going to get back to this again, but in Peyami Safar's novel, the house is something that's going to be inherited. The young man Ferit comes into inheritance through this, the property of the house. We see this in Bibi Tibushan's story, where he unexpectedly becomes Maliki. He unexpectedly becomes the owner of the house, or at least in his illusion, in his mind, he sees that. We have Tagore's protagonist, which is a tax collector. We have in Pedro Paramore, the protagonist goes there to get some money, to get something back from the father. In all of these cases, there's some kind of property or monetary element involved. And there's a relationship here as well between the spectral and the commercial, or the spectral and the idea of property, which we'll come back to at the end. But what I'd like to show right now is to show you the table, because really this is more or less where the talk is heading. So if you look, we've got all of what we're seeing as a kind of pattern here, and we haven't done the last novel yet, but already we're seeing the same kind of ghost, invariably female ghosts. The possible symbol certainly suggesting some kind of historical precedent, some kind of politically unpalatable memory which resists historical narrative, whether it's Ottoman, whether it's Second Empire, it's indigenous, or it's Mughal. And then, of course, in most of these stories, some kind of control over the protagonist is exerted, in some cases quite successfully. The protagonist becomes one with the ghost. In others, it's unclear. So it really sort of takes us on to the last text I'm looking at, and I'll do this very quickly because we're in 50 minutes now. But what we're looking at is one of the most famous and one of the greatest Turkish writers of the 20th century, Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar, and his very famous novel, The Time Regulation Institute, Saatleri Ayarlama Enstitüsü, which is about someone who wants to set up a time, as the novel says, a time regulator that would introduce a strict notion of temporality into the Turkish Republic and would quantify people's lives. And in many ways, it's considered, I think, a brilliant satirizing of the Kemalist modernization project. This is Tanpınar, and let me just briefly read the ghost story within it, because the ghost story in this very long novel really is a subplot that takes place in the first 30 pages of the novel, and then it's gone. So it's just it's a tiny little aspect of the novel. And just like Tagore's Pleasure Palace, it's about a crazy sheikh called Said Lutfullah, who lives in a set of abandoned ruins in the middle of the city of Istanbul. And these ruins for him at night, in the daytime, are ruins, and you guessed it, right? At night, they become filled with all kinds of visions that Lutfullah sees. It becomes a magical medrese, re-enchanted once more. And I'll read you even the text. The paving stones in the courtyard had been either broken or dislodged by an enormous plane tree surging out in all directions. Most of the rooms on the three wings were partly or completely in ruins. Büsbütün yıkılmıştı. As for the little mosque on the left side of the courtyard, all that remained were 4 front steps leading up to the minaret. The man walked in a world we could not see, görmediğimiz o alende. Among turquoise palaces, Firuze saraylarda, filled with gold, jewels, and silver-laced tapestries, a world that promised 1,001 delights. While wandering about that pleasure-filled world, he enjoyed a lover named Asılban, a beautiful creature with whom he frolicked among ever-blooming roses, hiç solmaya güller arasında, at the edge of a crystal pool, taking delight in the fragrances of jasmine and rose. So again, it's just noting the resemblance to Tagore's Pleasure Palace. Okay, again we have this kind of hallucinatory pocket of magic within the quotidian of everyday Istanbul, and again remarking as well on the time disparity. Right, we have this pocket of a pre-Kemalist Turkish Ottoman past, and obviously the Ottoman Empire ends in 1922, and then the Turkish modern republic begins. So in many ways, the ghost here is the persistence of this. Just as Tagore's palace was a persistence of, if you like, Persian pleasure, a bubble of Persian pleasure in the wake of British Raj modernity. So this Said Lutfullah's ruined medrese is this persistence, this bubble of Ottoman mysticism, if you like, of Ottoman glamour, of Ottoman magic in the kind of rationalizing air of present day, or at least at that time, everyday Kemalist Turkey. So again, we're really seeing, and the Persian words there are particularly relevant because as some of you may know, Persian was basically linguistically cleansed from Turkish throughout the 1920s. So the evocation of Farsi, of Persian, has this kind of ghostly feel to it as well. But again, we're talking about the persistence of this history in the present. And in many ways, what we've said about the ghost story up to now, that it's about the interruption of one time with another. A ghost story interrupts a time of the real world with a secondary spectral time, a different time. Is literalized in the novel, because what the novel is about, ironically, Tanpınar's novel, is trying to get an entire society to move from one time to another, trying to sort of modernize Turkey by getting its inhabitants to restructure their temporalities around a thoroughly different time. So the ghost here would almost be seen as a symptom of this traumatic transition that takes place when a kind of temporal violence is inflicted upon the pre-modern subject, as they are violently wrenched out into another chronos, if you like. And so you can see here some of the relationship building between the spectral and the temporal, and how the ghost story here in a novel like Tampanaz almost acts as a kind of mini metaphor for the whole novel. Even though it's only a tiny fragment of the novel, it's exemplifying in many ways, in a kind of microcosmic way, the wider theme of the novel itself. So I've really sort of like talked about all of the texts there. I promised myself I wouldn't do more than an hour, and I'm up to 57 minutes now. So I think I'm going to sort of wind up there and sort of open the session up for questions. If anybody wants any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Hello, sir. Thank you very much for this wonderful and insightful lecture. আপনাকে ধন্যবাদের জন্য অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ. Can you hear me?
I hope we're not having connection issues, because the internet in my house is not so good.
Okay. Can you find anything on your screen? Can you find anything on your screen? What is it in? So could you find anything on your screen? What is going on the screen? I'm taking the questions, so. Could you find a question?
What inspires a creative writer to write haunting stories? How does it differ across cultures? So I mean, I was trying to answer that in the talk, because it's not an easy question to answer. If we think about inspiration, I mean, there's certainly an attraction towards something. I mean, there's a sense of sensation which drives people perhaps to write about ghost stories. And I would even suggest perhaps, and I'm venturing away from the theoretical brunt of the talk now, but just now speaking freely, in thinking about the desire both to write and to read ghost stories, I'm wondering whether in secular societies, at least, there isn't something faintly post-religious about it. It's a kind of post-religious way for secular readers and writers to indulge in a sense of the spirituality, but without subscribing to any kind of like religious orthodoxy. And I certainly feel that that's the case in Western mainstream culture, that in many ways, things like, you know, the Netflix ghost stories and so on, fulfill a kind of function. They address a kind of metaphysical need to produce discourse about another world, but without necessarily bringing in all of the various sort of requirements and rules and what's moral obligations which many people would associate with a belief in the other world. But I was trying to say in the text that it differs amongst different cultures, because to some extent what people feel is unspeakable is historically located. And so when we look at the memory of genocide, we are going to sort of see different kinds of things emerge. if that answers your question at all, you're more than welcome to sort of text back. I hope I'm. So you mentioned how the sexuality of the niece, the femme fatale, can be threatening to the young male protagonist. Do we see a reversal of this in Henry James' The Turn of the Screw, in which the sexuality of the deceased Peter Quint threatens the young governess? That's an excellent question. Yes, and it raises an interesting point of like, because it's still a male novelist, right? So even though the roles, are reversed, we're still talking about anxieties, and we're still talking about losing control of textual devices and textual protagonists. And maybe it's testimony to James's, I was going to say almost metrosexuality, but that's the last adjective you give to Henry James, right? But certainly it's testament to his flexibility and his dexterity that he was able to sort of like put this in a reversed role situation. But I think that's an excellent question. Like, to what extent do we see female subjects possessed by male ghosts? There's a Mahashweta Devi story about, and it's set in, I can't remember which tribal group, whether it's the Mandals or whether it's Santals, but it's about someone who gets possessed by a ghost, and it is a male ghost. So what I'm trying to say is that you do have female writers enacting these moments as well. But yeah, that's a very good point. Whoa. So can we say that unknown is becoming more appealing than the truth, or I would say reality, and we are all dead people appearing to be living as certain fleeting illusions are being thrown by our unpredictable psyche? We all are ghosts some way or the other. Will you agree with the above notion? So, I mean, that's a very interesting point. The most obvious thing to say here is that, and Lacan, the theorist Lacan would probably say this, that if you think of the word in German for consciousness, it's the same as the word for spirit, and it's related to the word for ghost. It's Geist, right? Even how it's Geistespsychologie, Geisteswissenschaft, and so on. So I think someone like Lacan would say that in many ways we are the ghosts of our own body. There is something peculiarly spectral about the idea of consciousness. We are, in effect, we are bags of blood and meat and fat, but we are occupied by this chemical consciousness, to be utterly materialist for a moment, by this kind of chemical consciousness. So yeah, as you say, to some extent, we are we haunt our own bodies. I think it's a very good point. But I think you grasped something intuitive there about why perhaps we gravitate towards the effect of the uncanny in film and in literature, that there's something about the uncanny which echoes with our own sense of never being at home in our own bodies. Yeah, that harmonizes and that speaks to our own feeling of never really feeling of this constant sense of disembodiment. And that really gets back to the sexual, right? It gives you a good sense of how ghosts and ghost stories do seem to proliferate in sexually conservative societies. Victorian England is the most obvious example, like where people saw, you have in the most socially conservative times in England, in London, in the late 19th century, you have the rebirth of the ghost story, right? The Victorian ghost story. People are writing about ghosts, but I think you're quite right that there's some sort of there's an allure to that which is drawing people, I think. But yeah, I hope you're not too spooked out by your own sense of consciousness in writing that question. How is the underlying code of our behavior best communicated in a ghost story? What ways to connect to the history of how is the underlying code of behavior best communicated in a Mexican ghost story? I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand that question. What are ways to connect to the history of a place that make work well in a ghost story? I think the immediate thing I want to say here is that indigenous writers themselves in Mexican literature have had a struggle to find themselves recognized. So that's the first thing to say. So even though indigenous peoples have always been present in Mexico, yeah? So very few people outside Mexico realized that although many of them were decimated when the conquistadores arrived in 1518 through disease, through violence, and so on, by the middle of the 1500s, the population had reached pre-contact levels. So there has always been a large indigenous population, series of populations in Mexico. But this contrasts starkly with their representation in Mexican literature. And it's really been, I would say, only in the past 20, 30 years, in a serious way, that writers of Mixtec, Zapotec, Nahuatl, Isthmus Zapotec, these indigenous languages are writing in their own languages and able to sort of articulate feelings in their own voices. Maybe there are parallels here to West Bengal, because I know there's a similar question with regards to Dalit and also with regards to Adivasi groups. So that is the first thing, that it's been very difficult to sort of find ways to express this. And very often it's been the work of indigenista Mexican writers. So these are Mexican writers that are kind of European, to use the clumsy terms here, non-indigenous Mexican writers, who nevertheless have taken it upon themselves to try and articulate some of these narratives. But I would say that in this case, what you find is that the most interesting examples of the ghost story are unconscious. Okay, they're not. It's not that somebody sits down and decides to write a spectral narrative, initiating some kind of verarbeitung, some kind of working out of these unspoken histories. What's most interesting, I think, about the ghost story is that they are unconscious for the most part. They leak unintentionally and even unpolitically kind of non-recognition of the history at hand, if that answers your question. Gautam.
Okay, thank you very much, sir, for this enlightening session, and I think that all the participants who have watched it and experienced it, very, very insightful lecture. Even all the participants who asked questions, I hope you are satisfied with the answers, because we have learned a lot and we have got a different angle to next time whenever we go through any kind of ghost story. We will have a different kind of angle to analyze the stories also. So thank you very much, sir, for giving a valuable time to us. And hope the next time whenever I would rather our department or any other person would like to invite you and would get you valuable time next time too.
Thank you.
So
Asha Kore.
Dhanyavad আপনাকে. So sir, I'm taking you off from this screen. Then be there for 2 minutes, and I would like to talk to you. Then I will bid you goodbye. Okay, just I'm taking you off.
Sure.
So thank you very much for joining this session. This is session number 28, and the next session is coming very soon. And hope that just like the earlier session, this session also gives you more enlightening that information. And I do hope that you have enjoyed a lot this session. So, but thank you very much once again for joining and for getting this very illuminating information from our great academicians across the world. And our next session is coming soon. So when the next session will be fixed and you will be informed, Till then, tada, bye bye, stay safe, and obviously stay protected.